At 8:30 in the morning on a Thursday, the ground under San Leandro, California moved. Not dramatically, not for long, but long enough for a woman near the fault line to grab her kitchen counter and think, for one disoriented second, that history was repeating itself. She would later describe the sensation to a local television crew as feeling like being inside a big bowl of Jell-O, the whole room rolling gently side to side, while her dog looked up at her with what she called a sorrowful expression. 15 miles away in San Francisco, a newsroom shook. Desks trembled, coffee cups slid, and across a metropolitan region of roughly 8 million people, phones stayed silent because the early warning system built specifically to catch moments like this one apparently never fired for most of them. This is the story of that morning, and more importantly, it's the story of why scientists have been watching this exact stretch of California with a level of attention that borders on obsession for years. Because the earthquake that shook San Leandro on August 13th, 2026 wasn't some freak, unpredictable event. It happened on a fault line that researchers have been calling a tectonic time bomb, in the words of the United States Geological Survey itself. And understanding why requires going back nearly a century and a half to the last time this particular fault truly let loose. According to the USGS, the earthquake struck at 8:30 a.m. Pacific time, with an epicenter located roughly 2.4 miles northeast of San Leandro, close to the Oakland Zoo. In the confusing minutes, right after the shaking stopped, the numbers kept changing. The agency's automated systems first pegged it at magnitude 4. 0, then briefly upgraded it to 4. 1, as more seismic stations reported in. 20 minutes later, after human seismologists reviewed the data more carefully, the number came down. First to 3. 9, then, in a second revision, down to a final magnitude of 3. 8. This kind of back and forth isn't unusual immediately after a quake. Early magnitude estimates rely on the first few seconds of seismic wave data, and they get refined as more information rolls in from the dense network of monitoring stations spread across Northern California. What matters more than the exact decimal point is where this quake happened, and what fault line runs directly beneath it. The shaking was felt across a strikingly wide swath of the Bay Area. Reports came in from San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, Pinole, Walnut Creek, Alameda, Martinez, Pleasanton, Livermore, Fremont, and San Ramon. One resident in Walnut Creek, nearly 20 miles from the epicenter, said it felt like the house was being gently rocked, not violently, but unmistakably. The USGS classified the overall intensity of the shaking as weak to light, and there were no immediate reports of damage or injuries anywhere in the region. 2 aftershocks followed within about 40 minutes, a magnitude 3, 0, and a magnitude 2. 8, both centered just north-northeast of San Leandro, near the Oakland-San Leandro border, striking only 4 seconds apart from each other, according to local reporting. Smaller tremors continued to ripple through the area for the rest of the day, including quakes as small as magnitude 2, 2, and 1. 7, the kind of activity that barely registers to a human body but shows up clearly on seismographs. Experts quoted by local outlets in San Leandro pointed out that the quake may have been felt across such a wide radius in part because it was shallow, striking at a depth of only about 3 miles beneath the surface. Shallow earthquakes tend to deliver their energy more directly to the surface than deeper ones, which is part of why a moderate magnitude event like this one could rattle newsrooms and homes 15 and 20 miles away. It's a useful reminder that magnitude alone doesn't tell the whole story of how an earthquake will actually feel on the ground. Depth, local soil conditions, and distance from the fault rupture all combine to shape the experience for any individual resident, which is exactly why 2 people, standing a mile apart from each other, can walk away from the same earthquake with completely different stories to tell. Here's the detail that matters most for understanding why the story goes so much deeper than a single morning jolt. This earthquake sat directly on the Hayward Fault, a fracture in the Earth's crust that runs roughly 74 miles through the densely populated East Bay, from San Pablo Bay in the north down through Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, and Fremont in the south. The Hayward Fault is part of the larger San Andreas Fault system, the same tectonic boundary responsible for California's most famous seismic history, and it sits almost literally underneath the backyards of millions of people. Unlike some of California's remote desert faults, the Hayward Fault runs through some of the most densely built urban terrain in the entire United States. To understand why scientists treat this particular fault with such urgency, you have to go back to October 21st, 1868. On that day, an earthquake, estimated at somewhere between magnitude 6, 8, and 7, 0, ruptured a large section of the Hayward Fault. At the time, it was so destructive that Bay Area residents referred to it simply as the Great San Francisco Earthquake, a title later reassigned to the far more catastrophic 1906 quake on the San Andreas Fault itself. The 1868 rupture killed dozens of people, destroyed buildings across the East Bay, and left a permanent mark in the geological record that scientists have been studying ever since. The 1868 rupture is also historically significant for a reason that has nothing to do with magnitude. For decades afterward, it was the most recent major earthquake most Bay Area residents could personally remember, and it shaped early building practices long before modern seismic engineering existed. Then, in 1989, an entirely different fault, the San Andreas itself, produced the magnitude 6. 9. Loma Prieta earthquake, centered in the Santa Cruz Mountains south of the Bay Area. Loma Prieta killed 63 people, collapsed a section of the Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland, and remains the seismic event most Bay Area residents alive today actually experienced firsthand. It's worth being precise here. Loma Prieta did not occur on the Hayward Fault. It happened on a different segment of the broader San Andreas system entirely. But because it's the most recent large, damaging Bay Area earthquake in living memory, it's often the mental reference point residents reach for, including the San Leandro woman who told a television crew this week that Thursday's shaking made her wonder for a moment whether something on the scale of Loma Prieta was happening again. That instinctive comparison, and the fact that it turned out to be a very different, much smaller event, says something about how seismic memory works in a region that hasn't experienced a truly major Hayward Fault rupture in over a century and a half. Since that 1868 event, researchers using paleoseismic trenching techniques, essentially digging into the earth to read the fault's history like tree rings, have identified a pattern. According to work compiled by the UC Berkeley Seismology Lab, the Hayward Fault has produced 5 major earthquakes over roughly the past 700 years, occurring in approximately 1315, 1470, 1630, 1725, and finally 1868. The average gap between those events works out to roughly 140 years. The longest gap on record between any two of those ruptures was 160 years. Do the math from 1868 to today, in 2026, and you land on 158 years since the fault's last major rupture. That places the Hayward Fault deep inside its historical recurrence window, and uncomfortably close to the longest interval ever recorded for it. This is the origin of a phrase that gets repeated constantly in coverage of this fault: overdue. It's a loaded word, and it's worth pausing to get it right because scientists themselves are careful about what it does and doesn't mean. The USGS has been explicit on this point. Overdue, in this context, means the fault is deep within the historical range when major earthquakes have occurred on it. It does not mean a rupture is imminent, and it does not mean anyone can predict exactly when the next big one will hit. Earthquake timing simply cannot be forecast with precision, not by the Hayward Fault's history, not by any technology currently available anywhere in the world. What the probability estimates actually represent is a statement about accumulated risk over long stretches of time, not a countdown clock ticking toward a specific date. With that caveat firmly in place, the numbers themselves are still striking. The Working Group on California Earthquake Probabilities, a collaboration between the USGS and outside researchers, published an earthquake outlook for the San Francisco Bay region covering the years 2014 through 2043. Their conclusion, based on the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast model known as UCRF3. There is a 72% probability of at least one magnitude 6, 7 or greater earthquake, striking somewhere in the greater San Francisco Bay region before 2043. When you break that regional risk down fault by fault, the Hayward Fault carries the single highest individual probability of any fault in the Bay Area, at 33% for a magnitude 6, 7 or larger rupture in that same window. No other named fault in the region comes close to that number, and there's a wrinkle that makes the Hayward Fault even more concerning to researchers. In 2016, scientists confirmed something long suspected. The Hayward Fault is physically linked underground to the Rogers Creek Fault, which continues northward through Santa Rosa and the North Bay wine country. Connected together, this forms a single combined fault system stretching roughly 118 miles, capable of producing an earthquake as large as magnitude 7. 4 if the entire connected system were to rupture at once. That's a substantially larger and more damaging scenario than a Hayward-only event, and it's part of why seismologists keep such a close eye on this particular stretch of geology. So, what would actually happen if the Hayward Fault let go with a major rupture? This is where a study published just months before this latest San Leandro quake becomes directly relevant. In April 2026, researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published new findings in the journal Seismological Research Letters, led by author Ree Nakata and LLNL scientist Arben Pitarka. Using exascale computing, some of the most powerful supercomputing resources available to American science, the team ran 50 separate simulations of a hypothetical magnitude 7, zero earthquake on the Hayward Fault, modeling how the rupture in the underground rock structure beneath the East Bay would shape the resulting ground motion. Their conclusion was sobering. The shaking from a major Hayward Fault earthquake could be up to 50% stronger in several heavily populated communities than older seismic models had predicted. Pitarka explained the value of this new approach directly, saying that with this new database, researchers can not only provide better estimates of the expected ground motion from this type of earthquake, but can also locate the specific areas most susceptible to very strong shaking across the San Francisco Bay Area. The simulations pointed to a phenomenon called rupture directivity, where seismic energy from a fault rupture doesn't spread out evenly in all directions. Instead, it can focus in one direction, almost like a lens concentrating light, dramatically intensifying the shaking for communities positioned in that focal path. That effect is particularly dangerous for tall or flexible buildings, the kind that can resonate with concentrated directional shaking in ways shorter, stiffer structures don't. The study also identified specific geological features that make certain neighborhoods more vulnerable than others. Deep sedimentary basins, including the Livermore Basin, the hills of the East Bay, and the soft shoreline sediment known locally as bay mud, all have a tendency to trap and amplify seismic waves once they arrive. That means two neighborhoods sitting the same distance from a fault rupture could experience wildly different intensities of shaking purely because of what's underneath them. Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, and Livermore were all flagged in the research as areas that could see significantly stronger and longer-lasting shaking than earlier. Less sophisticated earthquake models had accounted for. This new research builds on an older but still widely cited piece of scenario planning known as the Hayward earthquake scenario, a detailed federal modeling effort that catalogs what a magnitude 7. Zero rupture on the Hayward Fault would actually do to the region, from collapsed buildings to ruptured water and gas lines to overwhelmed hospitals. Keith Porter, an earthquake engineering expert who worked on the Hayward scenario, described the underlying earthquakes on this fault as inevitable in comments reported by USA Today. The scenario was built specifically to make Bay Area residents more prepared for what its authors consider a certainty, not a possibility, but there's an important caveat that responsible reporting on this subject has to include. The Hayward scenario's damage projections were calibrated using building inventories and population data that predate the construction boom and demographic shifts the East Bay experienced through the early 2020s. In other words, the actual losses from a future major earthquake could differ substantially from the published projections, in either direction, simply because the region has changed so much since the scenario was built. Similarly, the broader 72% regional probability figure comes from a 2003 assessment whose underlying model hasn't been refreshed since its original publication, even though the window it covers doesn't close until 2031. Researchers acknowledge this is a real gap, and it's one of the areas where the science is actively evolving rather than settled. On the ground, Bay Area cities haven't been sitting still while researchers refine their models. Oakland, Berkeley, and Hayward have all adopted retrofit ordinances, specifically targeting the two building types considered most likely to collapse in strong shaking. Soft-story apartment buildings, the kind with open, garage-level parking underneath living units, and unreinforced masonry structures built before modern seismic codes existed. These retrofit programs represent years of policy work aimed directly at reducing casualties before the next major quake arrives. However, there's a catch here too. No comprehensive, publicly available dataset currently tracks how many of those flagged vulnerable buildings have actually completed their retrofits as of this year. The gap between policy on paper and physical work completed on the ground remains real, and it's something building safety officials and independent researchers continue to try to quantify more precisely. Why does building type matter so much to seismologists and engineers studying this fault specifically? Soft story buildings fail in a predictable and particularly dangerous way during strong shaking. Because the ground floor is largely open space for parking, it lacks the rigid walls that would otherwise help distribute the lateral forces of an earthquake. Under strong enough shaking, that open ground floor can simply collapse, pancaking the floors above it downward. This exact failure mode played out repeatedly during the 1994 Northridge earthquake in Southern California, and again during Loma Prieta. And it's precisely why the retrofit ordinances in Oakland, Berkeley, and Hayward single out this building type by name, rather than treating all older structures the same way. Unreinforced masonry buildings, brick structures built without steel reinforcement, fail differently but just as dangerously, with walls that can shear apart and collapse outward onto sidewalks and streets. Retrofitting either category typically means anchoring the structure to its foundation, adding steel bracing, or reinforcing critical walls, work that can cost individual building owners anywhere from tens of thousands to several $100,000 depending on the size and condition of the structure, which itself helps explain why completion rates lag behind the ordinances on the books. There's also a technical dimension to how researchers are able to say anything at all about a fault that hasn't produced a major rupture in over a century and a half. Modern seismic monitoring in the Bay Area relies on a dense network of instruments, including broadband seismometers, strong motion accelerometers, and GPS stations capable of detecting ground movement measured in mere millimeters. According to background reporting on this earthquake, Thursday's event alone was detected by dozens of separate seismic stations, giving researchers a location fix precise enough to place the epicenter within a few hundred meters. That kind of instrumental density didn't exist in 1868, or even for much of the 20th century, which is exactly why paleoseismic trenching, physically digging into the fault zone and reading the offset layers of sediment left behind by past ruptures, remains such an important complementary tool. Instruments can tell scientists everything about what's happening on the fault right now, in real time, down to the millimeter. Trenches can tell them what happened centuries before anyone was recording data at all. Combining both approaches is what allows researchers to build a recurrence history stretching back 700 years from a fault system that has only been under close instrumental watch for a few decades. The Pacific and North American tectonic plates that create all of this seismic activity in the first place are sliding past each other at a rate of roughly 46 millimeters per year, a slow, continuous, grinding motion that never stops, even between earthquakes. Most of that movement along the Hayward Fault doesn't happen instantly during a large quake. A significant portion of it occurs through aseismic creep, a slow, mostly silent slipping of the ground that scientists can measure using precise surveying and satellite-based instruments, but that people walking down the street would never notice happening beneath their feet. Creep can actually be seen with the naked eye in a handful of places along the fault, in curbs, sidewalks, and building foundations in cities like Hayward that have visibly cracked and offset over decades as the two sides of the fault slowly grind past one another. Scientists monitor creep rates closely because they help indicate how much accumulated stress along different fault segments is being released gradually versus how much is locking up and building toward a future sudden release. Segments of a fault that creep steadily tend to produce smaller, more frequent earthquakes. Segments that lock completely and don't creep at all are the ones capable of storing enormous amounts of strain for centuries, and then releasing all of it at once in a single large, damaging rupture. Figuring out exactly which sections of the Hayward Fault are creeping and which are locked is one of the central ongoing research questions driving continued monitoring of this fault today. Now, back to that Thursday morning quake and the detail that a lot of residents found genuinely unsettling. Multiple people in the shaking zone reported that they never received a shake alert notification on their phones. Shake Alert is the West Coast's earthquake early warning system, a joint effort operated through a collaboration between the USGS, Caltech, UC Berkeley, and other partners in the California Integrated Seismic Network. The system is designed to detect the first, faster-traveling waves of an earthquake and push out alerts to phones and other devices in the seconds before the slower, more destructive shaking waves arrive, giving people a few precious seconds to duck, cover, and hold on before the real shaking starts. Under the system's current design, Shake Alert issues public alerts only for earthquakes of magnitude 4, 5, or greater. Because this quake was ultimately measured at 3, 8, well below that threshold, the lack of widespread alerts may not represent a system failure at all, but rather the system working exactly as designed for an earthquake of this smaller size. It's a distinction worth understanding, because the system has demonstrated real capability elsewhere. Back in June of this year, on June 24, 2026, Shake Alert delivered advance alerts to more than 1 million residents across Northern California, including the Greater Bay Area and the Sacramento region, ahead of a magnitude 5/6 earthquake that originated near Willits in the Mendocino Range. That event showed the network operating as intended, reaching state and national distribution channels within seconds of the earthquake's initiation. Whether Thursday's smaller San Leandro quake exposed any gaps in how the system communicates magnitude thresholds to the public, or whether this was simply the alert system correctly staying quiet for a below-threshold event, is exactly the kind of question seismologists and emergency planners will be reviewing in the aftermath. There's also a strange coincidence worth mentioning, one that residents in San Leandro have already noticed. On the Wednesday before this earthquake struck, San Leandro city officials had specifically asked residents to review proposed updates to California's official earthquake fault zone maps, part of an ongoing statewide effort to keep hazard zoning current with the latest geological data. Less than 24 hours later, the ground moved. It's not evidence of anything beyond coincidence. Earthquakes don't respond to municipal meeting schedules, but it's the kind of detail that understandably makes a community sit up and pay closer attention to exactly the geological reality sitting beneath their homes. There's a broader economic dimension to all of this that rarely makes it into the immediate news coverage of any single small quake, but that seismologists and disaster planners think about constantly. A major Hayward Fault rupture wouldn't just damage buildings. The Haywired scenarios modeling extends into utility infrastructure as well, projecting that water pipelines crossing the fault could rupture in hundreds of locations simultaneously, potentially leaving large sections of the East Bay without reliable water service, including for firefighting. At exactly the moment, fires are most likely to break out from ruptured gas lines and damaged electrical systems. That combination, water shortages colliding with a spike in fire risk, is one of the reasons planners consider a major Hayward Fault event to be a fundamentally different kind of disaster than a typical natural hazard. It's not simply about the initial shaking. It's about the cascading failures that follow in the hours and days after, when emergency services are stretched thin and basic infrastructure is compromised across multiple systems at once. Insurance industry analysts have also flagged the Hayward Fault repeatedly in recent years as one of the most significant unpriced risks sitting beneath any major American metropolitan area, given how few homeowners in earthquake-prone regions of California actually carry dedicated earthquake insurance, as opposed to standard homeowners policies that typically exclude seismic damage entirely. It's worth putting the Hayward Fault in context alongside its neighbors, because the East Bay isn't a single fault line, it's a whole network of them. Just to the east runs the Calaveras Fault, another major branch of the San Andreas fault system. Its most significant recent rupture was the magnitude 6. 2 Morgan Hill earthquake back in 1984, and more recent moderate activity includes a magnitude 5, 6 event near Alum Rock in 2007, and a magnitude 5, 1 quake in October 2022. Some researchers believe the Calaveras Fault links up with the Hayward Fault as well, near the Carquinez Strait to the north, adding yet another layer of complexity to how seismologists model the risk across this stretch of Northern California. None of these faults operate in complete isolation from one another, and understanding how stress transfers between them is itself an active area of ongoing seismic research. When one fault segment ruptures, it can measurably increase or decrease stress on neighboring segments, a phenomenon researchers call stress triggering. It's part of why seismologists don't study the Hayward Fault as an isolated line on a map, but as one component in a much larger interconnected system of faults threading through the entire Bay Area, from the Rogers Creek Fault in the north down through the Calaveras and San Andreas faults to the south. A rupture on any one of them has the theoretical potential to shift the timeline on its neighbors, even if by a small and difficult-to-measure amount. Zooming out to a global scale for a moment helps put California's seismic activity in perspective. Across 2026 as a whole, worldwide earthquake tracking has recorded 5 earthquakes at magnitude 7, 0 or greater, with the strongest being a magnitude 7, 5 event in Tonga. On the deadlier end of the spectrum, a magnitude 5. 8 earthquake in Afghanistan caused 12 fatalities, the deadliest single seismic event of the year so far, contributing to a global earthquake death toll of 21 people through the year to date. Compared to that backdrop, Thursday's San Leandro earthquake, a magnitude 3, 8 with light shaking and 0 reported injuries, sits firmly in the category of routine seismic activity. The kind of event that happens somewhere in California on a fairly regular basis without making national news. What elevates it beyond routine is not the earthquake itself, but the fault line it happened on, and the decades of accumulated scientific concern attached to that specific 74-mile scar in the earth. So what exactly are scientists watching now in the days and weeks following this quake? First, and most immediately, they're watching the aftershock sequence. Aftershock activity from an earthquake this size can continue for several days, sometimes longer, gradually diminishing in frequency and magnitude over time. And monitoring that decay pattern helps seismologists understand how the fault segment is behaving right now, whether stress is dissipating normally or whether the pattern looks unusual compared to historical sequences on this same fault. Second, researchers will be feeding this event, however small in isolation, into the broader models used to track long-term stress accumulation along the Hayward Fault, alongside ongoing measurements of what's called aseismic creep, the slow, continuous, non-earthquake movement that occurs along parts of this fault system and that scientists monitor as a kind of pressure gauge for the rest of the fault. Third, in the wake of the shake alert questions this event raised, expect continued scrutiny of how alert thresholds are communicated to the public and whether residents in the shaking zone understood why they didn't receive a notification for a magnitude 3, 8 event. And fourth, the newer LLNL and LBNL simulation data from earlier this year will likely continue feeding directly into engineering conversations about building codes and infrastructure hardening across Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, and the other communities the research flagged as facing potentially stronger than expected shaking in a future major event. None of this is meant to induce panic over a magnitude 3, 8 earthquake that, by every account gathered from the USGS and multiple on-the-ground news outlets, caused no damage and no injuries. Small earthquakes like Thursday's are, in a very real sense, normal background noise for a region built directly on top of one of the most seismically active fault systems in North America. But small earthquakes on a fault this significant tend to draw outsized attention precisely because of what sits underneath the headline number. This is a fault that produced a destructive earthquake in 1868 that paleoseismic evidence shows ruptures roughly every 140 years on average. That is currently 158 years past its last major event. that carries the highest individual earthquake probability of any fault in the Bay Area, according to USGS-affiliated researchers, and that new supercomputer simulations suggest could produce shaking up to 50% stronger than older models assumed. Put that context around a Thursday morning jolt near San Leandro, and it's easy to understand why residents felt more than just a passing tremor. They felt a reminder. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where all of this information comes from and where the honest uncertainties remain. The details of Thursday's earthquake, its magnitude, timing, location, and the lack of damage or injuries come directly from the United States Geological Survey, along with contemporaneous reporting from outlets including the San Francisco Standard, KRON4, and Patch. The historical and probability data on the Hayward Fault's rupture pattern and its 33% chance of a major earthquake by 2043 comes from the USGS and the UC Berkeley Seismology Lab. The new ground motion simulation findings are drawn from the peer-reviewed study published in Seismological Research Letters by Lawrence Livermore and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory researchers, including direct comments from lead scientist Arben Pitarka. Details on the Hay-wired scenario and its inevitability framing come from earthquake engineering expert Keith Porter, as reported by USA Today. Where real uncertainty exists, it's been flagged as such throughout. The exact reason shake alert notifications weren't widely received. Thursday remains unconfirmed and may simply reflect the system's magnitude threshold working as designed rather than any malfunction. The regional 72% probability figure rests on a model that hasn't been updated since 2003. And the haywire damage projections are acknowledged by researchers themselves to be based on aging population and building data that may not reflect the East Bay's current growth. Details on retrofit costs and soft-story building failure mechanisms reflect general seismic engineering findings documented following past California earthquakes, including Loma Prieta and Northridge, and are included here as established engineering background rather than claims specific to Thursday's event. Any projections about future utility failures or water infrastructure impacts are explicitly scenario modeling, not predictions of what will happen, and should be understood as planning tools rather than forecasts. It's also worth being upfront about what remains genuinely unknown right now. Nobody, not the USGS, not the researchers at Lawrence Livermore, not any independent seismologist can say whether Thursday's magnitude 3, 8, earthquake represents a truly isolated routine event or an early sign of shifting stress along the Hayward Fault that might matter for the broader recurrence timeline. Small earthquakes happen on this fault system regularly, and the vast majority of them carry no special significance beyond themselves. Distinguishing genuine warning signs from ordinary background seismicity is one of the hardest open problems in earthquake science, and anyone claiming certainty in either direction, that this quake means nothing or that it means something ominous, is going beyond what the current data can actually support. So here's the question worth sitting with. Knowing that the Hayward Fault sits directly beneath some of the most densely populated cities in Northern California, that it's statistically the most likely single fault in the region to produce the next major Bay Area earthquake, and that new research suggests the shaking could be stronger than anyone previously modeled, what do you think it would actually take to get retrofit completion rates and public earthquake preparedness to match the scale of that risk? Is it more public funding, stricter deadlines on building owners, better public communication about alert systems, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts below, because this is exactly the kind of question that deserves a real conversation, not just a headline. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.